So good evening, everybody. My name is Tamar Russell Brown. I'm from Gallery Sitka. We're located in Shirley, Massachusetts. And this evening we are discussing our Harvest Art Show, which was a juried show which we launched last weekend online. We have a number of women artists from all over the Northeast. We have a New Yorker who's on Long Island, we have New Hampshire, and we have Massachusetts. And this evening we're going to spotlight Susan Wadsworth. She's the president of the North Central Massachusetts chapter of the WCA. And so this evening we're going to be talking with her about her pieces and her career, and then a little bit about her travels and some of her Italian work, which I think is fun to discuss this time of year. We have with us Francesca Manisco. She's a really good friend of mine. She's a New Yorker. She's also Italian, so she's raised and educated in Rome and New York and lives between the two of those locations. And she's an advisor to the gallery on everything New York with all the museums there in the city. So we're going to have a full evening today. We'll be on for an hour. We ask that you hold your questions until the end. And then Doreen Lascala, who's a local fine artist, is going to help us with questions at the end if anyone has them. So to start off, we're going to talk to Susan. I wanted to ask Susan a little bit about her career. She was a professor here at Fitchburg State University in downtown Fitchburg for many, many years. And so Susan, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your education first, and then how you came to be in Fitchburg.
Well, I just wanted to also put out there that I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. One of the jurors was from Philly. So that's sort of a close, at least it's Pennsylvania. And one of your questions was how we began as an artist. So when I went to Connecticut to school, when my parents retired and moved to Vermont, you had to take an art course. And I also found that when I was growing up and in high school, you either were athletic, smart, or artistic. You couldn't be any of those two. And I was smart. So I had to take art. And then I found out I loved it and I fell in love with it. So I went to Colby College in Maine and earned a BA in art, and art history, took as many courses as I could. A couple years later, I went to Cranbrook Academy of Art, where Jennifer, that juror, was very familiar with. So maybe sometime we can connect personally and talk more about Cranbrook. I had a very interesting teacher there, and basically we just worked. We didn't take courses, we just worked and were critiqued once a month pretty brutally. The teacher was George Ortman, and it was only later I found that he was following a lot of the theories of Hans Hofmann, who was one of the early abstract expressionists. So I learned a lot about looking from George Ortman. And a few years later, I really wanted to teach. And I thought, well, if I get another degree, in addition to the MFA from Cranbrook, maybe I can teach better. So I got an MA in art history from Tufts. So when Fitchburg was looking for someone, they actually hired 2 people that year. It's a really long story, but I ended up at Fitchburg State, and where I could teach both art history and studio art. And gradually I moved away from the studio art and taught more architectural history and even Asian classes, and even Asian with some music, some interdisciplinary. Because I'm fascinated with how the music reflects the culture as well as the art. I don't listen very well, I don't hear very well, but I can at least make some connections for students. Yeah, so that's my education. I was teaching, and yeah, that's probably enough of that question.
No, I love it. I love to hear the story. So I'm very curious, Susan, did you start making art as a young person or as an adult? What was the process of you becoming a fine artist?
Well, my aunt was an artist, very, very traditional. And I remember she used to give us sometimes art lessons in the summer in Vermont, at a different place in Vermont, in Manchester, Vermont. And I remember trying to draw an egg. She was very emphatic that it was very important to know how to draw an egg. So I did okay. But it really wasn't until I got to high school that I fell in love with art. And I took some drawing courses, but I don't have that kind of traditional background that my aunt had. I like abstraction better. And when I was at Cranbrook, actually, one of the professors, when they had an all-college crit, so all the professors went around and saw all the work in architecture, fiber, jewelry, everything. And I think it was an architecture person who may have come and talked to me and said, do you know about the early American modernists? Like O'Keeffe. And I knew about O'Keeffe and Stieglitz, but I did not know about all the others like Dove and Hartley and they've been a huge influence on me. The abstraction of shapes, it just fascinates me.
And they're wonderful. I think that's a hallmark of your work is the shapes. That's something that you can't miss, the colors and the shapes. Those are the two really interesting things about your work. So I also wondered, I know you didn't have a lot of comments about harvest, the topic of harvest, but I love your place in Vermont, in Arlington, or on the border. And I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about that place and the time of year that we're in, which is the end of the summer, how the colors shift there. Maybe that would be a little more interesting than the topic of harvest. But if you have anything to comment about harvest, go ahead.
Yeah, you're right. I don't follow themes very well. And what I wanted to say about harvest was it was fascinating to hear the jurors talk. And one of them, I think Pat, was very emphatic that she follows the theme. So I'm surprised I got two small pieces into the show because they don't really follow the theme. But the colors, I sent you, as you know, all the fall works I did last fall. I retired in August last year, so I was able, for the first time, to really draw in the fall instead of teaching. When you have 120 students, you don't do a lot of artwork during the school year. So a lot of it comes from that place in Vermont. And I went, especially in the spring and last fall, and really studied how the trees change. And I really want to get to the point that I can look at these hills and say, that's a white pine, that's an oak, that's something else, an ash, by the colors and by the texture of the branches. So I'm getting very into branches and texture. The smaller green piece that got into the show was done from the upper meadow of that place in Vermont. And I was trying to play with texture and color, etc. But Vermont and the land, and of course they did used to harvest there. I just find, like, I used to have a vegetable garden, but it was so much work. And just as soon as the tomatoes get ripe, some stupid animal comes and takes a bite out of them before you pick them. And I'm like, what a waste of energy. I'm going to go buy my tomatoes from local farms that actually know, they need the money, they need the support, and I don't want to do all that work.
They know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. Let's leave everything to people.
And it's good. It's tasty, Hi, yep. Catherine.
Hi, Catherine. Hi, Gail. Lizzie's here. Linda's here. So I'm going to flip the screen and I'm going to show everyone Linda's two pieces. And then I thought we could have Linda talk a little bit about them. So these are the two pieces. This one.
Those are the ones that got into the show.
Could you tell us a little bit about what they are, where exactly they are?
Well, this is the upper meadow, which is a very special part of that place in Vermont. You can barely see one house through the trees very far away. There are all these hills around, and the black, it's a layering of pastel. So I first usually draw in pencil first, unless I'm really sure, and then I draw in black ink. Then I layer the pastel about 15 or 20 layers until it's right. And then I go back over it with either pencil or ink, depending on how emphatic I feel. I've just been using ink since 2015, so I'm really studying it a lot. So these are trees, again, the white is actually white ink, which is, pointing up the birch tree that was right there, etc. Trying to get the gesture of the trees. This other place, the Ashburnham one, is on the way to the kids' school. I drove by it for several years before the fall when I had time to sit and actually try to, capture the colors of the fall, essentially, and the magic of that. A little bit of water and reflections.
Yeah, they're really wonderful.
I try to find the simplest, most essential forms, and sometimes it looks really easy, but it took me 20 or 30 or 40 years to get to this point that I can do it and not erase it until it's right. I do some erasing, but generally it's, I don't know, anyway.
Well, I like them. I think it's nice that the judges chose them, and I think the colors were perfect. So what is it special about that place in Arlington this time of year, this sort of harvest time of year, would you say, in the colors of this time of the summer?
And they change so much. There's never a point in New England where all the colors are bright at once. I always think there's an early fall peak before the oaks start to change, when they're still a little green, the maples are orange, and you've got a peachy color out there and everything else. What's also really cool about the fall is how individual little trees that are nothing you never see during the year, suddenly they are bright and they stand out for that week. And it's just like my little time to shine. And it's so cool. So I love that. I'm going to be a lot in Vermont this fall, studying that transition as much as I can. Sometimes the hills seem to be like all red, but there's always some other colors in there.
So I know, Susan, that you did a great deal of traveling as part of your educational career. Was the traveling that you did part of your career as an artist or as an educator, or a bit of both, or just because you love travel?
All of the above. All of the above. Yeah, my husband tends to like to travel to places that speak Spanish. So that's why we went to Guatemala and Spain in the last couple of years. And I just updated my webpage with images from 2 years ago in Spain. But I traveled some with my parents when I was growing up. We went to England, particularly because we have cousins there. But in 2001, in the middle of my teaching career, I decided to take my young 7-year-old son, who's now 26 and about to get married, and 6'6", but he wasn't 6'6" then. And he had no front teeth. He was so cute. It's a typical 7-year-old without any teeth. And we went through Italy, and we went to see little hill towns. I think we went to Assisi, definitely went to Venice, went to Florence. And then in 2016, I took my daughter to Italy, and we had a great time. And in between, I taught there for a month in Verona. Fitchburg State has a program in Verona, and it's fascinating. And I taught the history of Italian, art and architecture as much, and mostly the Renaissance, but a little bit of earlier things too, because I wanted to connect the Roman ruins, the Romanesque ruins, the Renaissance stuff with the students. So as they wandered around Verona, they'd be looking and recognizing things. And there's a lot of Mannerist stuff in Verona, which is really interesting. And a lot of people don't know about that period. So it's just weird, the little heads on top of columns and things you don't expect. And my theory is that Verona was really prosperous at that time. So they were doing the most up and coming art and architecture. And it's a little subdued, but it's everywhere. It's among the Gothic windows and all that stuff. So I've always wanted to go to Asia, so I got some grants, and my trips to Japan and China were pretty much paid for through different groups that I went with, and that I felt very special about that. And it was also very safe to travel in a group of professors. Also fascinating, because we had different fields totally. And this was, I'm blanking on the group that we went with. It'll come to me later. But we had designers, we had economics professors, history professors, and it was really cool to learn about China and Japan with them. Yeah, I'm totally spacing out on that.
No, that's
the one thing I didn't write down a note on. Oh well.
Well, I'm sort of, I love to ask these questions that aren't prepared as well. So that would be a good segue for Francesca, but I have more questions. So
Okay.
I wanted to hear about two other things that I love in Susan's life. One of them is this interesting place that they go to in the summer often with her husband and their family. It's called Key Wayden, and she has done a lot of paintings from that area. So I wanted to hear about Key Wayden, if you had a few comments just about what it's like painting that place. Maybe
Well,
you should hear what Key Wayden.
It's the experience of Key Wayden Camp on Lake Temagami in Ontario. This is an hour north of North Bay, 5 or so hours north of Toronto. So we're like way up in Canada. My husband went there as a camper when he was like 14 or 15. My daughter and my 2 sons have gone there. I also went out on a 5-day older woman's canoe trip. But the kids do that much more intensely, and they work up from a 3-night overnight over the years to a 7-week trip up to Hudson Bay. And the young women are doing this, just like my daughter who's listening right now. They form incredible friendships. She was talking with her friends recently about how it's kind of a cult. If you don't know about the, carrying a wanigan on your back with, the tent and the sleeping bags. Well, actually the sleeping bags are all in a roll. they have a certain way of doing things that it's been done for over 100 years. And these boys and girls learn to interact and to survive and to push themselves through, you know, a mile portage or something like that. And I felt the same way. And my son was so cute before I went. He said, "Mom, one step after another." And that's how I got through the portages. That's how I got other people through the portages. And you know what? Now in life, especially as things are getting more and more complex, one step after another, one class after another, one project, one piece, and you focus and you get there. The camp is on an island, and there's something wonderful to me about the red pines and the shapes of the red pines, which are very Japanese against the water, and the pine needles. And I've been trying to draw up there off and on for about 20 years. I've just finally, I think in the last year or two, done pieces that for me evoke the simplicity of this experience. And I just want to put a plug for, it's not only the camp, but at one end of the island, there's also an adult camp place that you can go. And in some ways, I think it is a perfect vacation if you don't mind driving 866 miles to get, or 666 miles to get up there. Because it's wonderful, because sometimes women go on vacations with their families, they still have to cook. They still have to change the diapers. You still got to do all that stuff. The cool thing about this place is they ring the bell, you go, you eat, you leave. You don't have to shop, you don't have to think, you don't have to order. You meet the most interesting people, and they have generators, but there's no electricity on the island. There's a little bit of internet if you're lucky at the right point, at the right day. But they have kerosene lighting in the cabins that you can stay in. They do have plumbing. They have small little bathrooms, but they have a shower and they have what you need. As long as it's not an outhouse, I'm happy. And it's a really wonderful, wonderful place to go. And you can go out on trips. You can go just canoe around the island, or you can just sit and read. You know, it's one of the most relaxing places. And I want to get you up there, Tamar.
I don't think we can handle it. The portage situation. Oh my.
Oh, no. On the island, the camp, the adult camp thing, you don't have to do portaging at all. You just have to walk from your little cabin to the dining hall and back.
That's not bad. It sounds
that's easy.
About what my mom used to do as a kid. She used to go to camp in one of the Great Lakes up in Michigan. So it's kind of, I think, this similar concept, except yours is much farther away. So that's very interesting. And then the other thing I wanted to ask about is this is an all women's show. We invited the Women's Caucus for Art North Central group to come. And then you guys also invited the New Hampshire, one of the pods in New Hampshire to come. So you're the president of our local WCA organization. And so I wondered if you could just make a little plug or a statement for that organization and tell the public what that organization is all about. Or maybe I know that the local WCA is going to be 20 next year, I think CM told us. So it's an interesting organization I'd never heard of. And I think for young women who are in the art world, it's a good organization to hear about.
And I'm very proud that we have 2 younger members to our group. They're not all almost retiring like me. Catherine Judge, who's part of, he's listening to me right now. She knows a lot more about this. I've only belonged for a few years. She belonged to the earlier version of this, but I think our group is special. It's a small group. We get to know each other. We are not interested in having a group of 100 people. We have probably a dozen, maybe 15, and we get together and we decide where we're going to try to submit for shows. We hang them together. We get the food together. We've gotten to know each other. Quite often during the year, we'll visit each other's studios and talk, have lunch, when it's not COVID and all that kind of stuff. And now we've actually, I think, been doing a few Zoom things. So, we're trying to keep the tentacles together. It's just a very special group. I know some people get more political than others, but you don't really have to be. I think it started as a very political group. But it's really cool to have a show of just women, and there's no guy taking all the attention or anything like that. And we can support ourselves and understand where we're coming from. And we are open for new members. Just look up Women's Caucus for Art, or WCA, and you will find the national chapter to join. You can join individual chapters also, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. We're organizing right now, I think, another group of Western Massachusetts artists into a new sort of group. And Catherine knows more about this than I do. But we're always trying to grow and have more shows. So
Thank you very
does that
much.
answer your question?
It does. Thank you very much. So I wanted to introduce Francesca Manisco. She's a very good friend of mine. We've known each other, I believe it's been about 10 years, if I can say that. I can't believe time flies. Does that sound about right? I feel like it's 2009 or 10. And she is in New York City, back and forth between Italy, and she was born in London, so she's had quite a life. And she's my advisor. She assists me with some decision making for the gallery, and also is a tour guide for me in the galleries in New York City and the museums. So I thought it would be really nice to have Francesca with us this evening to talk a little bit with Susan about Italy, because Susan has some wonderful images, which I'm going to just mention to you, Susan, if you want me to pull something up on the screen while you guys talk, just tell me which one, and I'm happy to pull it up on the screen so we can look at it. So I thought it would be fun. Like, Italy is definitely a place that I think of when I think of harvest. And Francesca, I couldn't find the Condé Nast Traveler article, so I'm going to ship you I couldn't find it online, so I'm going to ship you the article in paper. It's a wonderful country. It's really beautiful. The food's wonderful, of course. At least I think so. And Susan's paintings of Italy are very interesting. So I thought that we could discuss a little bit about her Italian trips from an Italian perspective, and Francesca is our person for that this evening. So without further ado, I'll let the two of you take the screen here.
Well, thank you, Tamar, and thank you for inviting me on your podcast. It's very exciting, especially because it's all women artists, and it's just nice. Susan, there's one thing that I grew up with, and that is that you can't have art without fashion. You can't have fashion without architecture. You can't have fashion architecture without food. You can't have all those three without math, sciences, and algebra, and geometry, and it's all combined. And so I call myself an intellectual at large. So when I see artwork like Susan's, and I was telling her the other day, I feel like I'm perching on the Rocca d'Assisi, for I am in the garden of San Giusti. And and that's the beauty of your artwork, Susan, is now I understand that you have some architectural background. So I don't really have a question, because those paintings are complete. I'll look at them and sit there. But how did you the perspective, does your study of architecture influence your artwork a lot?
I think it does. Tamar, why don't you put up the one of Assisi with the funny little views and stairs? I don't have it whether it's 1, 2, or 3, or because that's how I usually label things. Yeah, that one.
Marocco, yes.
So that is the Church of St. Francis in the background.
Mm-hmm.
So some of these have actually been influenced by Cubism and the different views you get in Cubism, but I smooth the transitions, so it's not necessarily flat cubes, but you get, like, each of those separate sets were ones that we actually walked on, but they weren't necessarily next to each other like that. Coming into Assisi, we walked along sort of the garden, like on the left with the little tower. I think on the right, there were like restaurants and things like that. So I'm so pleased that the people that know these places can feel them when they look at my works. I think sometimes it's a little odd for people who haven't been to Assisi to look at this and say, what is going on there? Don't really know what's going on. But, I just want to share my feelings and hope that they connect with the people who have been there, and I also find them very comforting, because there are lots of round forms, kind of more like Matisse actually than Picasso. And I find those very comforting, mothering. I had a whole mother series that is too much to talk about right now too, but the comforting, the closeness. Sometimes when I sit up in my studio, I feel very comforted by all the pieces that are kind of like around me at the time.
I also like to bring the attention to the Giusti gardens, which are incredible, incredible gardens. They seem to go on forever and ever and ever. I've promised myself next time I go to Italy, which hopefully will be soon. I must go to Verona and see the Giusti Gardens. It's just unbelievable. Again, I see this pattern of the curves, the circles, the welcoming like you have in your family pictures. There's a sort of a sense of embracing other than perspectives and view. So that's what I like about your work. It's the simplicity, but also the presence, being present, which is very, very important. And on this one, I like the roof. On top of the columns, there's a bit of a roof up there. I don't know if Tamer can highlight it. Yes. See,
It's funny.
because usually most paintings, they just have the arches, but you don't get the ceiling. And here we get the ceiling, which is nice. It gives me a sense of I'm on the terrace looking out on the view. Again, what I also see here is the pines, and the reason why the pines are tall is because the roots would be deep in the ground, and if you have trees with big, like an oak tree, the roots will break out in the ground. It's the same. In other words, trees are like mushroom. Okay, I'm losing my. I'm getting distracted. Tall, thin trees have thin roots going into the ground, so they don't break up the construction and the bricks. That's why you see tall, thin trees in cemeteries. You don't see oaks because the oak has big branches and then the roots come out. And so that's an interesting thing about these gardens. But the other thing, I also feel you captured in light, and I like the chimneys. You have some chimneys there.
Here, the chimneys here.
And yes, those are chimneys. Those are not church steeples.
I was
Am I
just
correct?
thinking general towers, but yeah, whatever.
I get a feeling that they're chimneys in there. Could you explain to us also Assisi, the view of Assisi? It looks rather cavernous.
So that, I think, is that castle, that ruined castle that's on top of the hill that you
Okay.
can go up to walk. And I'm always fascinated. Like, actually, you see that light brown thing on the upper right in this one. You see
Okay.
that light brown ruin.
Is
And
that La Rocca?
I believe that's what we see in the next one. And I'm very interested in looking through things. And that works in a general idea of content too, looking through the superficial to the depth of meaning or views or forms or whatever. So there are these really rough remains of this castle. And I believe this is a little seat that maybe some ladies might have sat on and been able to look out through the window and see, you know, what was happening outside, as well as what was going on in the main room.
And I also believe La Rocca was a bastion, a castle, a war castle. Well, I have to
Yes.
brush up on my history, but it was a military post, and then the La Basilica di San Francisco is outside of the walls of La Rocca. But again,
Now,
I went there when I was 12 years old with my class, so that was some time ago.
Well, you and I talked about the incredible Giotto-esque paintings that are in the church. And I don't get into doing like totally detailed things like that, but the experience of that church on all three levels is just amazing. And it's too great to put into a drawing. So everybody has to go to Assisi because that church is amazing.
So these two here are in the same location,
Yes.
The same town, but different parts of it.
and this one here is which town?
That is in Verona, which is about an hour from Venice. And this is where Fitchburg State had its program. So this garden was sometimes a 10-minute walk from where we were living. And I think most students got there at least once. And this little arcade is just, it's really not much bigger than what I did. And it's just up perched on top of the hill, looking over the gardens. And on the left side, you'll see kind of a swirl, which I think refers to the mazes. Yes, exactly. So the mazes that they had. And there's like this great big scary face over, you know, one of the entrances. And there are little rooms and they're kind of deteriorating, but there are things in it. again, it's somewhat Mannerist or sort of post-Renaissance reaction. And it's just gardens back then were really cool. It's fun to walk around.
I think it's known as a mascara, and
Yeah.
that face, that mascara, you can see from most spots in the garden, and it reminds me of the gardens of Bomarzo outside of Rome, between Rome and Grosseto. Giardini Bomarzo with the big monstrous sculptures, and you can walk into the mouths and all that.
Yeah.
So it reminded me of Bomarzo very much.
Put up Cortona. Now, Francesca, have you been to Cortona?
No, I haven't been to Cortona.
Well, I asked a friend of mine who was the liaison in Verona. I said, I'm coming over with my daughter. Where should we go? And she said Cortona. Cortona doesn't have a lot of art per se. It's really a cooking town. So everybody takes cooking lessons. And we didn't do that. We walked around, and I keep joking with my daughter because she was 17 in 2016. We drank wine like lunch and dinner, and totally enjoyed their lower age of drinking. And then we would have cappuccino after lunch so we could still make it up these hill towns and walk around and not be too much under the influence of wine. So we were walking around Cortona a lot. And I was experimenting with space. So the balustrade in the front comes from, I think, sort of a public piazza. And some of those views are from there, but I put in some other things too and simplified it. The church down in the lower right, I believe, was designed by Alberti. It's not in that spot in Cortona, but there is an old church by Alberti. That's it. I think it's Alberti. Could be Bramante. A Renaissance dude, in any case. Yeah.
So Susan, what year is this? It's 2016, this piece here?
Yes, 2016.
Interesting. So how has your, how many times have you painted Italy? Like how many times have you been?
4 or 5, I can't even think, at least, something like that. I probably, because I spent the spring of my junior year in college, I was in Florence, Italy, which was, of course, the obvious major influence, but I didn't do any drawings there. I was just studying art history. But in subsequent trips, and while, studying or teaching in Verona, I was still working on all this stuff. And that big one was actually finished in the studio. So I would do studies and then work them up when I get back from wherever I've visited. And this is that's also Italy. That's from Cermioni. I don't know whether, I go to these weird places that no one else has ever heard of. But Cermioni is on Lake Garda, and it's not far from Verona. And it was a place that other professors recommended that we go to. And we actually stuck it in at the end of a field trip. Instead of going to see, I think, Alberti's church in Mantua, which I really wanted to see again, we ended up going out to Cermioni. We only had about a half an hour to see this incredibly huge ruined Roman villa. And so I went back that weekend and spent a day drawing there. And again, we're looking through old Roman arches that were just amazing. And then you see like new trees coming up, and actually in the water, there were a lot of Italians in their fancy boats, and they were swimming and having a good time. But I like the older stuff better. And I haven't framed this piece. I really like it. I will do a series of 15 or 20 pieces, but I can't afford to frame all of them. So I only frame like 1 or 2 from the series, and they get into a lot, I enter them into shows. So it's always a surprise when I go through my portfolios and find things like this also is not framed. That one was from Urbino. Have you been to Urbino, Francesca? I don't have anything from Rome. Rome is too big.
We don't go to these places when we go. No, I haven't been to Urbino. Now, the previous place, Simeone, could you please explain that it's on a lake and it's not by the seashore? It's a lake in northern Italy, Venice. Now,
yeah, definitely Venice.
That's the Guggenheim Museum. That's not. Or is that Ponte dei Sospiri?
It is the Guggenheim Museum, but it's not necessarily. I combine different views. Okay. So we have my daughter's glass of wine and some flowers, a gondola. Then I was playing with the windows. I wanted them to look different than, because sometimes when you look at them straight on, that's what they look like. But
it was an Ottoman part of the Ottoman Empire, so you had that shape of windows, a rabbit shape, if you want to call it. again,
I love all
I'm
that.
not, yes, not being an architect, but it's the Ottoman Empire influence, if you want to call it that.
And then I wanted something in the back, and the Guggenheim Museum it's an unusual spot in Venice because it's all modern art instead of all the old stuff. One of my favorite places.
Yes.
So have you painted Rome, Susan?
I visited Rome. I love visiting the Pantheon. I love visiting the architecture. The markets of Trajan are some of my favorite places because it's so cool that there's this like mall with this incredible richness of shapes and arches, and wandering around and try to imagine those little cubicles with scarves and food and, you know, all kinds of stuff. I love that. But in general, I'm not a city person. Growing up in Pittsburgh was it. I'm in a country now. I live on a lake. I will visit Rome, but I'm not keen on living in any cities. That's just how I am.
Rome can be very overwhelming.
Like any city.
I know. I grew up in Rome, so
What was your
like
favorite
any
spot in
city.
Rome?
I grew up in. I was lucky. In the '60s, I grew up in Piazza del Popolo, and I went to a school in Via Ripetta, the Scuola Media Statale di Fermi, and I did 5th grade and middle school in Rome. And in those days, when I crossed Piazza del Popolo, it was a parking lot. So I'm absolutely delighted that today I can walk through it and it's not a parking lot, and there are no, I mean, it must be 25, 30 years that they took the cars away. But I remember when it was a parking lot. And but every morning you went to school and you came back. And in those days, school was from Monday through Saturday. You finished at 1 o'clock and you came home, and we didn't have tourism at the time the way we do now. And then when I came back, I grew up in Pezzanavona. And again, tourism hadn't hit yet. It was the 70s, 80s, the dark years, Yanni Bui. And now it's just, nobody wants to go to the center of Rome any longer, unless you're going to visit the Pantheon, of course, because that's a magical building. It's just with the oculus and the idea that that whole sphere can be turned upside down, and the oculus would be 1 meter off the ground, and it's just, you know, it's just fantastic.
It is. It's my favorite.
So if anybody goes to Rome, visit all these monuments and places early in the morning before it gets hot and the traffic hits. That's the best time.
Good advice.
The one thing I wanted to hear about is I think a lot of things have been said about the lack of travel right now being good for some of these old places because there's less human effect on them. And so I was kind of curious, in both of your travels, is it a negative that we visit and walk on all these historic relics, or should we?
Well,
Are you walking on the relics, or are you visiting the relics?
Well, when you visit them, you walk on them, you know?
I think it's really important to visit these places. And I'm also thinking in terms of, I took one trip south to see Confederate battlefields, which is, you know, the Confederate stuff is a big issue right now. But I think that visiting these places gives you a whole nother insight. We visited 24 battlefields that particular trip. And I think visiting the architecture of Rome, you don't know the Pantheon until you go in and you feel that space. And I was not expecting it to be like that. I mean, that's how they did it. They had a sort of a Greek front. They kind of hid the dome. So when you go in, it's like, so I think it's a benefit. And I think it's a benefit to learn about all these places in art history, and then to go there and get that depth. But you've got to be careful. You can't overdo it. And the people that really know how to guide masses of people through places of interest are the Chinese. When I was in China and visiting the terracotta warriors, the 8,000, now it's 8,000 terracotta warriors, they knew how to, you know, take 20 or 200,000 people and how to marshal them up one walkway and then out through the souvenirs. They were pretty smart. And you don't get to sit and just look. I mean, I didn't like that part of it. They, you know, you have like 10 minutes with the guide to explain it, and then you're out of there. And, you know, so it's nice to have a little bit more freedom when you visit these places. But I think it's important to have that experience rather than, and I know that when we lived in Verona and students see the fresh vegetables and they've got to cook with them or use their whole budget to go out, they walk more because they don't have their cars. They lose weight. They get, you know, better nutrition than they have at home. I was amazed that the supermarkets have about one shelf that's maybe about this big, and that's where the junk food is. And when you go here, we've got aisles and aisles of junk food and junk drinks. So just seeing how different people live and eat is also, you know, just amazing. And I think it's fascinating in terms of starches. You know, one half of the world has rice, other people use potatoes. In Italy, it's pasta. You know, it's just fascinating what they do with all this stuff.
Yeah, actually, sorry, Francesca, go ahead.
No, about the history of food, and it's always about water and flour, water and rice, water. It's always with a grain, and you know, there's a big debate where does spaghetti come from? Is it from China? And in China they did rice noodles, and in Italy we did flour and semolina with water, and then we always have the other big debate, and this is one of my hobbies, is the pizza and the piadina, and we have the taco, and we have the enchilada, and everybody has water, grain, and it's worked together into a sort of pasta or a flat, round sandwich type thing that is always rolled up with a filling. And we have that in China, and we have that, it's all across the world. And it's just the filling and the spices that change. And it's one of the big human common things. And about markets in Italy and all over Europe, and how you go shopping and eating in China. I've been to Beijing twice. It's the freshness of the food. In Beijing, you can't find the can opener. They don't have cans. So the biggest gift I could give my daughter was a can opener. Shipped from America. And she started laughing because there's no canned food. Even if you went to the Carrefour in Beijing, then there's no, it's all, and so yes, the markets, it's really important to see the markets. Some of them are centuries old. Maybe they've changed, they put in refrigerators and they've modernized the center or the shopping center per se. But there is a constant conversation with food, and you go at 8 in the morning and you buy your zucchini, and now we have zucchini flowers that are being fried, and we have certain type of fish because it's the summertime, end of summertime, and we have the eggplants, and gosh, I wish I was there at the moment, but I'm happy with my farmers market at Tompkins Square Park. But it's, again, it's the market, the conversation, meeting people in your neighborhood, and cooking, you know, just simple cooking at home. It's really great. The other day I bought red onions in Tompkins Square Park, and I had to go buy key food, and the Indian cashier, she was like, oh my gosh, red onions. It reminds me of my country. And that's what's beautiful about architecture, food, music, art. We're all, and when culture, it's just, it's all tied in. And it doesn't matter, it does matter where you come from. And so, but we all cook, and we all need food and art.
We get that all from art. I mean, you can't taste art, but certainly that's what I was thinking of with the concept of harvest, is that, you know, there is, which Francesca and I were talking about before this. Usually here in New England, we think of harvest as the fall, maybe, the pumpkins or the end of the season. But technically we're in a harvest now because this is a very fruitful time of year from the vegetable garden in most of this country, most of the parts of this country. So it's really a special time of year no matter where you are. And it flips whether you're on this side of the equator or the other. You know, we each have this year when everything starts coming in, and it's really wonderful. It does make you think of home. So like I think of home this time of year because there's something so overwhelming about the heat. And where I come from, the heat was overwhelming. So every summer I think of home, which is why I liked the valley where Susan lives, because the heat was strong there. And I was shocked that Vermont was so warm. It made me think of home. The shapes of the hills, the fact that it's a deciduous forest. So there's certain things that come with the harvest time of year, which is always the warmer time of year. Usually, although Francesca and I were talking, it could be winter as well. You harvest pine trees maybe in the winter. So it's a very interesting topic, and it definitely brings people together. And that's why I was loving the article that I read in the Traveler magazine last night, because it talked about a food writer who had gone to Italy. He had his 10-year-old son in the car with him. This 10-year-old son says, "Oh, let's go up there on that mountain to that little village." And the father says, no, we've got to get on the road to this town. We have a restaurant appointment. He was reviewing a restaurant. And then he said, you know what? I'm going to go. We're going to go. We're just going to go. And they go to this little restaurant, and they have the most incredible meal. And it was like stuffed, what did I tell you, Francesca? Stuffed squash.
Flowered zucchini. The flowered zucchini.
Oh, yes.
It's stuffed with mozzarella and a bit of alice, or it's a alice in English. It slips me, and it's fried. I like my zucchini fried with a bit of lemon. But it's again, and the common thing about harvest is, okay, every season has its own harvest except for winter. But the autumn harvest is special because it's when the fields, the grain is cut and the fields are sheared practically. And no matter where you are in the world, it's these waves and waves of light, of fields going on. So whether you're in Maine, Vermont, or wherever you are, or you can be in Italy, it's the grain has been cut, and we've got waves and waves of land reflecting in the sunset or at dawn. You know, it's just, and we all have the same problem that nobody works at noon unless, I mean, it's just wonderful. It's my joy in living in New York is we have corn now, corn on the cob. Or at this point, the corn is so fresh I eat it raw with a bit of olive oil and salt. But that's something that's typical American. But I also, when you told me about the flowered zucchini fried, oh my gosh, I miss those as well. And I know I'm going to get some zucchini flowers, and it's the only time I fry in the year in New York City. As I get a bunch of zucchini flowers, and I'll make myself a plate of fried zucchini just because it's the season. Roast peppers is another one.
It's the season.
And it's the color, and it's in the paint and the artwork as well. It's also how you build the fruit, and you make all these, you build these trophies and stuff like that. Architecture. Heavier fruit goes on the bottom, the lighter fruit, smaller fruit goes on top of you, and you create a pyramid. Again, you know, art, architecture, fashion,
food.
They're all tied in together. Can't have one without another.
I wanted to ask Susan if she had any last comments for us about her pieces for this show and her work in general.
How about just the new pieces, the big pieces? Because during COVID, well, retirement kind of morphed. Show one of them. Retirement for me kind of morphed into COVID. So I was already sort of establishing a kind of a relaxed routine. So COVID didn't really make that much difference. So I decided to be pretty bold. So I started doing a couple of 10-foot drawings. And they look like they're oil on canvas, but they're really pastel on paper. So I did one abstracting from this Vermont place and one based in Kyoto. Could you show one of those, Tamar? Are you trying?
Susan, do I?
The magical spring, maybe?
Did you send them to me?
Yeah, I did. In fact, you had it up there briefly. They're in that list.
Okay, let's see. We'll pull that up again. Give me 1 second.
That's the one that's based in that Vermont property that Tamar knows, where the hills are very much like Tennessee and elsewhere. And I was very interested in sort of an abstracted texture for each area. And in the spring, again, I got to study it better this year. The way that each week that you go, the colors are different. Some trees are just budding in red and some are green. So I really had fun doing this. And that's the Battenkill River that you see swooping around there. And I was playing with textures, and it's also ink. But the next one, This one, again, I couldn't travel this summer. Usually I travel and work up a lot of pieces. So this is based on last year's travel to Japan. So this is various sections of the garden around the Silver Pavilion in Kyoto, Japan. And so using ink, I think, is appropriate. And I'm just kind of playing around with how to do branches in a different way and just having fun. And the cool thing about these is that they're just on paper and I can just roll them up. And if they're really bad, I can just tear them up. And it's not a lot of money. There's no canvas. There's no stretchers. I don't know how people will frame or hang these or something if they get them, because they are 10 feet wide by 42 inches high. But I'm not going to worry about that. I just felt like doing them. So I'm playing with a new kind of like tension in the space, in the landscape, and I'm still working on that. Anyway.
So Susan, from which view is this?
On the left, you have sort of the upper meadow, and it kind of folds out. I'm not sure I ever took you up to the upper meadow. I talked about it, but you kind of had to rush off one or both days.
Well, is the upper meadow the one that you talked about putting a platform in?
Yes.
Yes,
we actually have benches up there now, so we can sit. It's great.
Yeah.
So on the right is the ridge that you see from that upper meadow, and I kind of folded out the meadow. So the hill on the left is actually the one that's before the house and across the river, and you've got to go across the bridge, and that's called Dugway. And then on the right is the ridge. And then there's a little bit of a sort of a Zen circle with the only house that you can see, which also kind of represents sort of habitation. I'm very inspired by not only Japanese art, but Chinese art, and fascinated by the idea of the Ming dynasty and those artists. I believe it was in the Ming. They disagreed with the politics and they didn't like all that hassle. So they just went off into the woods and worked. I like that idea. Just go off in the woods, forget the rest of the world. Just do what you want. Only they would do like calligraphy, and they would do sword work and all kinds of stuff. So that little sweep of the meadow on the left, you got those three little sort of tag things. That's an abstraction of a Japanese character called Shin, which means heart and soul. So I'm trying to bring Japanese kanji or characters into the artworks. I've been doing this for a few years. Some not in every piece, but it's something I'm experimenting with. Because when you look outside, at least in New England, sometimes Francesca's not going to see this at all. But I'm talking about white pine trees that rise above the hills. So those skyscrapers are no good. But the white pine almost looks like a Japanese character in and of itself. So that's when I'm trying to sort of integrate Japanese and Chinese. Well, they're the same characters, even though the languages are so different. That's also kind of a creepy idea. But anyway, I'm trying to include those in. And they usually say things like they mean heart or mindfulness or eternity or peace. And I have to label them with the names because I keep forgetting what the kanji are. There are a few kanjis of trees down along the edge of that meadow before you get to the river. So there's only like 3 kanji in that one, but anyway.
So Susan, where does your fascination with this Asian style come from? Do you know?
I'm not sure. When I was growing up in Pittsburgh, we lived next to this deserted 6-acre property that was just falling apart. It was a beautiful old mansion and going to pot. And there was a Japanese pavilion there. And it was in terrible condition. But there was a Japanese garden that was also kind of dying. So you could see that maybe back in the 1870s or 90s, people would walk through the garden and go to the pavilion. But I also got interested in martial arts. I've done a lot of work in Japanese sword, and sometimes the movement of the sword is similar to the brushwork in the kanji. And meditation is part of my life too. So I don't, you just sort of take these ideas and you just run with them. And then they die out and you go on and you move, like the kids grew up, so I'm no longer doing the childscapes, and then you go on to do something else, and then you go on to do something else. And I'm looking right now at Catherine's beautiful Risen series that's behind her. And I think that you are on next week at 6 o'clock. Yeah. So we are going to hear you talk then, and I can't wait.
So does anyone have any questions for Doreen here at the end? Doreen, do we have any questions? Anyone have a question for us? Or for Susan? Or for Francesca? How's it going in New York, Francesca?
It's wonderful in New York.
Nothing, Doreen?
No, I don't see any in the chat box.
Very good.
That makes it easy.
I'd like to add something about Rome that maybe Susan has noticed, having studied architecture. I have a friend who passed away. His name is architect Richard Kaplan. And he told me when I first met him, he said, "Oh, you're from Rome. Rome is beautiful." When I went to Rome as an architecture student from Princeton and I saw Rome for the first time in my life, I thought, how presumptuous of me to become an architect.
That is a great quote.
And
That's
that
amazing.
is, if anybody goes to Rome, call me. It is centuries and centuries of architecture, and it is unbelievable. So,
And the space is, you know, how they could carve space and space for people. It's not churches and stuff. They're markets, basilicas. It's
piazzas.
awesome. Yeah.
Piazza Navona, Piazza del Popolo, all the big squares, Piazza Repubblica. It's a sense of, you live in small houses, but everybody meets in the piazza and you stroll, and that's part of the culture. And, but it is an architect's wonderland. So don't look at it as just a Colosseum and that's an old building and the lions ate the Catholics. No, there's architecture.
Everywhere.
It's something we could all learn from the Europeans on the lifestyle, definitely.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Tamar.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Timmy.
From Gallery Sitka, and this is Francesca Manisco, and Susan Wadsworth was our feature artist tonight in our Harvest show. If you go to the gallery, it's gallerysitka.com. On the website, there's a Harvest tab. Susan's work is on the tab. There's 2 prints there that were juried into this show. We thank you all for joining us, and we welcome you back next Friday night, 6 o'clock. We'll have CM Judge with us next week. So please come back. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Tamar.
It was wonderful.